The cafeteria there's like 40 polling things in the cafeteria. And if you're a registered to vote in the state of California, you can just show up there and vote anytime. So as soon as we're done here, don't do it now, please, but go do your civic duty. And I know some in the other room were like, yeah, I voted on my way in. So people are taking care of that here. So that's why we're doing this. And we've been told next week we're back in the cafeteria in our circle and all of that. So, but we are just making it work. Thank God we didn't meet on the field. That was plan A, was to meet under the big tree where we do our baptisms. Because it's been such a beautiful spring or winter, right? It's been so beautiful, and when we made the decision 2 weeks ago, we couldn't look 10 days ahead on weather.com yet, and we were like, but that's going to be that one cloudy, cool, rainy day, that one day of winter that we have every year.
And it is.
And it is. So thank goodness we have a roof and walls, and we just, and I hear it just worked really well. Although I know it is a little crowded, and so we apologize for that. But trust me, our Vineyard kids are all crammed in one of those tiny rooms next door. So blessings to those workers who have an hour and a half in a tiny little room with all of the children. So we're gonna go, and I'm excited to be preaching in this urban landscape, and I'm doing some urban street preaching today. We debated last group, is this Long Beach, Santa Monica, Miami? I don't know where we are, but I'm excited to be in this urban landscape. And so anyhow, well, it is, we're a bit out of the ordinary, and so, but I've been wondering lately, what is ordinary? You have one of those weeks, you're like, am I the weird one? Am I the one that's just a little off? We went to San Francisco on Monday, just for a day, Abigail and I, to basically have dinner and then fly back. That's what you do when you have 4 children. And one of them doesn't allow you to be gone overnight. So we basically, Southwest is great for that. Those $29 fares each way. Went for dinner, and the whole day, I was like, this is so out of the ordinary. Just spend a day in San Francisco, and you're just like, what is normal? We were in a store buying clothes for our kids, and a man came in on a bike with a syringe in his mouth, a needle in his mouth, riding around the store, and nobody at the store batted an eye. They just kept helping people. They're like, next in line, and we're like ducking, and like, oh my gosh, there's a man with a needle riding his bike. There was a security guard chasing him, and eventually they got him to the exit, but that was like our introduction to the day. And then we get on Bart, Bart. Some of you are from the Bay Area, you're like, oh boy, here comes a story. And a man gets on, and I think he was dressed as like a woodland creature, of some kind of woodland creature, because he had leaves and everything coming out of his hair and a gown on, and he kind of got onto the train, and of course sat right next to us, and we're just like, oh goodness. And that was just 2 of about 10 interactions we had with people where we're like, are we weird? Is this just, no, I don't know. But anyhow, so today is a little bit out of the ordinary, and I'm not going to try to pretend it's not. And so we're just, instead of, we're just going to embrace that and do things a little bit differently, even in our teaching and preaching time. Typically what happens if you're here on a Sunday, I or somebody like me stands up and gives what amounts to like a 30 or 40-minute monologue about God and the Scripture, and that's kind of what it is, and that's all well and good, but actually this setting is where I spend my Monday through Friday, and I've been doing that for 16 years, teaching more in a setting like this, like a classroom, and it's not just a monologue, but it's interaction, and there's participation, and it's much more organic. And so I'm going to try to do that today and make it so there will be participation, and there will be times where I'm going to ask for volunteers, and I know that makes some of us cringe. I'm like, no, just let me be. But there will be even some times to give input or ask questions, and we may get to everything. I have some places I want to get to, some questions I want to pose from the text that you were hopefully given as you came in, or you can share one with someone. But if we don't get to everything, it'll be okay. We'll do this again next Sunday, hopefully down there, and we'll do it all together, and we'll just keep on moving. Because we've been, this whole year, we've been here in the Gospel of Mark, and we've been kind of meandering our way through for about 7 weeks now. I do have to show you this because Kathy sent me something I've got to put up here. She said, Jacob, every week you put this graphic up there about the Gospel of Mark, but I only see one thing, and so I'm going to superimpose what she sees underneath on the next slide. She says, this is all I see, though. If you look here at the bottom, this is what Kathy sent me. She said, you've been putting this up every week, but all I see is a rabbit. So this is an ancient manuscript of the gospel, and I just pulled that when I created this graphic. And now you're not going to see anything else for the rest of the series, right?
That's right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to Kathy. Whenever I put this up every Sunday between now and Easter, you're only going to see a bunny, which may be apropos. It is now the Easter bunny, thank you, that we have added to. It's all subliminal, which is what we're about, right? So it's there. So anyway, I had to show you that this morning. We're in Mark chapter 8. Did everybody get a paper, hopefully, on your way in? And if you didn't get a paper of the text, does anybody have one that you could share with a neighbor? That, like, they can get one over here. Thank you. And we'll just kind of share. And I want to make sure everybody had the, oh, we got more in the back. I printed lots of copies, so we should have plenty. As we proceed through this morning, and as we have been proceeding through the Gospel of Mark since the beginning of 2020, today there's going to come a moment where you're going to kind of feel the tone and the tenor of the text change. And so I want you to kind of wait for that moment. There's just going to kind of come a moment where you're like, whoa, 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 everything seems to change here. Like the whole story, we're halfway through the story of Mark's Gospel, and about halfway through, everything suddenly changes. So I want you to kind of be paying attention for that. It's a pretty drastic change. But if you've been with us since the beginning of this year, for the first 7.5 chapters, which is where we've been, Mark has kind of had one agenda in mind. From the very opening verse, Mark plays his hand. I mean, he is like, my agenda is this. And he says, Mark 1 verse 1 says, the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. So for Mark, there's no question who Jesus is. He tells us from the opening verse. And he tells us that what he is going to write is going to be good news. And it's going to be about this man, Jesus, who he says from the beginning, he says, he's Messiah, he's the Son of God. And he kind of plays his hand up front. And then he spends 7.5 chapters, which is where we've been so far, talking about what that means. If Jesus is who he says he is, who Mark says he is, if he is the Son of God, if he is Israel's Messiah, what does that mean? What does that look like for him to be the beginning of good news? What are the ramifications of Jesus being Israel's Messiah and bringing good news to the world? And that's where we've been, really, this good news of new creation, as Paul will later write about this, as Paul writes about Jesus, talks about it as new creation, bursting forth, something new being born, right in the middle of this broken, sick, dying world. Something new is being born, and this is good news, and it's coming through Jesus, Israel's Messiah. I was walking through Glendora yesterday, and I was praying about this moment and this Sunday as I was walking. And I walked by my favorite tree in Glendora. Abigail and I have this tree, and some of you will know this tree when I put a picture of it, because I noticed yesterday, for the first time in 2020, it's beginning to flower. It's beginning to burst forth with new blossoms. How many of you know where this, anybody know where this is? It's right in front of the Glendora Historical Museum. Which, by the way, if you want to have an awesome 24 minutes, it's about how long it takes to get through it, the Glendora Historical Museum, which takes about 24 minutes to walk through, is a fabulous history of our town here. And right out front, there's this tree, which for most of the year is like brown and dead looking. It's an ugly tree. But yesterday, as I'm walking underneath it and praying, it's like God said, look up. And I look up, and there's these yellow buds. And this is only going to grow. I think for every Sunday between now and Easter, I'm going to progressively show the tree, because this is new creation, isn't it? It's bursting forth. Something beautiful is being born on this tree, and it's beautiful, and it will eventually erupt, and the whole thing will be canary yellow. Abigail actually painted this. Abigail never told you she can watercolor pretty well, and we have a painting of this somewhere hanging. of this tree and this view north if you look up Glendora Avenue. So if you live in the area or you just want to drive north, go drive by this tree. And the Glendora Historical Museum is open for 4 hours a week, between the hours of noon and 4 on Saturdays only. So
wow.
Put that in your calendar, and if you're looking for a fun Saturday, let me tell you, you do not need all 4 hours. I'm telling you, 24 minutes. Anyhow. And so what do we see? We see new creation bursting forth. And Mark shows us this through the gospel. Like, what does it look like for new creation? He's like, well, people who are sick are getting well. People who are in bondage to spirits are being set free. And Jesus is taking authority over everything. I mean, that's like the key word. But Jesus' authority always brings healing, wholeness, and freedom, which is the exact opposite of the authority of the empire. Mm-hmm. It just does the exact opposite. And so Mark continues to show us time after story after story after story. He's healing a paralytic, then forgiving the paralytic, then healing the paralytic, then opening blind. I mean, all of these things are happening. He's on a boat, and the natural, nature is in chaos. And what does he do? He takes authority over that. He can control it. He has authority even over the natural order. And we see this over and over again through 7.5 chapters. Now, all of this basically draws 3 responses from the people in the text. There are 3 basic responses. Some decide, well, I want to follow that man. Or at least I want to, or I am. Can you think of somebody in the text so far who makes that decision to follow? This is like participatory. You can shout out.
Lots of them.
Lots of people. Well, some of them are obvious. Like who? Like these young Jewish boys, Peter, Andrews, James, John, and all of them. They're like, yeah, we're going to follow. Although we're slightly confused as to who he is. We're following him. And then there are others who want to follow, and Jesus actually tells them not to.
Yeah, last week.
Yeah, last we looked at the guy in the Gerasenes who was filled with the legion of demons, and he's set free, and he's like, oh, let me come with you, Jesus. And Jesus is like, no. You go home and tell your family what the Lord has done for you. But he wants to follow. So that's one response. And who else? And of course, many women are following us. So we see this throughout all 4 Gospels. And so you have those who follow, and then you have those who are simply confused. Those who are like, we don't know what to. Most of the general populace is there, right? They say over and over in Mark, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Say even his own disciples. They're like, who is this person, this Jesus? And so there's a lot of confusion. That's the second response. Third response is, then we see rejection, don't we? And outright hostility. Some are just hostile. Some want nothing to do with Jesus. And throughout, Jesus continues, no matter how people respond to him, Jesus has the same response in Mark, and that is, don't tell anyone. He continues to say, okay, don't say anything. Don't tell anybody what I've done for you. It's almost as if Mark wants to keep this a what? It's called the Messianic secret in Mark. He's keeping a secret. And there's a reason for that, a literary reason that we'll eventually get to this spring. Which brings us to today's text and our first opportunity for participation. Who would read for us? It's Mark. We're going to read 22 to 26. So it's like the first section on your paper there. Is there someone that would read that in a very confident voice? Look at all the hands going up all over the room who would participate. Liliana, thank you. Liliana is one of my students in 8th grade, and so I know I can call on her. Go ahead, Liliana. Read it for us.
They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had sit on them, he put his hands on him. Jesus said, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village."
See what I told you? Jesus heals a man. What's the first thing he says? Don't go. Mum's the word. Don't tell anybody. We'll get to that eventually. I always like to, if you're part of our church, I always like to locate things on the map, because geography, I found, plays a huge role in a lot of these stories. And so let's look at our map here. They're in what's called Bethsaida. Bethsaida is on the northeast shore of the Sea of Galilee, a very small, conservative Jewish area. And so Jesus takes his disciples here don't have time to get into how they get here, but they're blown off course in a storm, and they eventually end up here in Bethsaida and on the northeast shore of Galilee. Now, as we read the text, we'll get back to why that matters in a minute. Any initial observations as we read? Thank you, Liliana, for being so brave to read. But as Liliana read, was there anything that just feel like, well, I have a question about that, and we may not be able to answer it. That's not necessarily what this is all about, but it's just a question, or I noticed that. Anybody have something? Christy?
Why did it take 2 tries?
Yeah.
Or that it was progressive healing?
Why is this a progressive healing? And did anybody notice that? And you're like, huh, that should cause us a pause, because I don't think of anywhere else we see that, right? Typically, if Jesus wants to heal a person, the paralytic, he just like, get up and walk, and the man gets up and walk. There's no progressive healing there. I mean, the guy speaks Jupiter into existence. You're telling me he can't heal blind eyes? I mean, you're like, whoa, this should cause us a major pause. Like, why is this a progressive healing? Why does Jesus have to pray twice? Very good question and astute observation. Anna?
Well, I wondered about it, and I was thinking about blindness, especially if you were blinded from birth or at a tiny, tiny baby age. He would have to heal 2 things, the ability to hear, and then the mind to comprehend what he sees.
So maybe we have maybe we're on our way toward an answer. Any other observations or anything? Yes.
The spit.
Why is he spitting? This is weird. Most of it, I mean, is there anything grosser than humans, getting someone spit on you? You're in the front row here, and Jacob spits on you, and you're like, oh gosh, hope he's okay. Yes.
So it says people brought a blind man.
Right.
Maybe they heard of Jesus doing miracles, and they just wanted to see, because it wasn't somebody who really loved him. And in the other stories, it talks about someone who loved someone, bring him towards God, and they have the faith that he's going to heal them.
Right.
Plus his own faith.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why it took a little longer.
Okay. Good point. Any other thoughts? Howard?
Pastor, I want you to explain to me why he led him out of the village.
Ooh, that's good. Yeah, I wrote that down. Why does he take him outside the village? It might have something to do with that, hey, we're not telling anyone what's going on here. If I do this inside the village where everyone's watching, maybe. We're never. How did he know it?
Right.
Yes. I see what looks like trees, but I've never seen, so okay. He's only felt trees, perhaps. I assume that's what they are. I've thought of that one too. That's good.
I've heard one theory about why he said trees, is that the first time he opened his eyes, to more like a spiritual realm, maybe seeing like angels and other spiritual beings walking around, like tall trees, and the second time was physical eyes.
Now we could chase all of these questions or comments, and it would take us the rest of our time here, and probably into next week or the week after, because you just opened a whole bunch of cans that we can't get into all of those. But remember, I said 2 weeks ago, I think some of the points of a sermon isn't just to give answers, but to start conversations. And hopefully we've started some here that we can continue. But I do want to push towards another idea, perhaps, another thought. Last week I posed the question, out of all the stories that Mark has that he could have written down for us, right? I mean, the material was endless, according to John. John's like, we have so much material on Jesus that none of the books in the world. Out of everything he had, why would he choose that story? Why that? I posed that question last week. Why does Mark include this story? This week I want to add another question to that, and it's simply this. Why did he put it where he put it in his story? Why did he organize it that way? Why is this story where it is, exactly halfway through his story? Why this story? So halfway, exactly, there's 16 chapters in Mark. Mark never wrote with chapters in mind, I get that, right? But here we are in the middle of his story. He has a story about a man who cannot see, and then he can sort of see, but it's a little blurry like trees, which that's a great question. We could chase that. And then he can see clearly. It's progressive, right? There's this progressive thing happening and this progressive healing. Now, I want to connect that with what I said a few minutes ago about Mark's purpose in the first half of his book, which is to talk about who is Jesus? Who is this Jesus. What might Mark be doing here in this story? Is this simply a story? I'm just posing another question. Is this simply a story about one particular historical blind man in one particular little location called Bethsaida? Is it a story about one progressive healing in one blind man? Or is it that, yes, I'll grant you that, but also is there a literary thing going on here? This is much bigger than that. This is about this is about collective eyes being opened to see who this Jesus is. Could this be Mark's way of saying, this is collective eyes to see who is this Jesus and what does it mean for him to be Messiah? And might we be reading a progression here that if we chase this a little bit further, Mark will answer that, which means we need another reader. And I think he gives us the answer to that in the very next verse. In verse 27, somebody not named Liliana, who would read our next section, 27 to 30. Thank you.
Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him.
Oh, there we go again. Don't say anything. Thank you, Lauren. Back to our map, because this will make all the difference. They were in Bethsaida. It says they then went to a place called Caesarea Philippi, 25 miles away due north. Very different city. Bethsaida, conservative small Jewish fishing village. Caesarea Philippi, named after Philip, one of Herod's 3 sons, who named the city after himself. Remember, Herod the Great dies in 4 BC. He divides up his kingdom with his 3 sons, Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Philip. And Philip, the tetrarch, gets this region. This is Philip's region. So what does he do? He names one of the cities after himself, which tells you a little bit about how Philip saw himself. He then gives a nod in 14 AD to his buddy Augustus, Caesar Augustus, so the city is now called Caesarea Philippi. He builds a magnificent temple in honor of Augustus, who was then worshipped as a god in Caesarea Philippi. If you read a little bit about the history of this city, this was a Greco-Roman city. It was the capital of that region. He made his city the capital of that region, where he then ruled. It was dominated by immorality and pagan worship. There was another temple. Let me show you a picture of it here. This is the remains of the temple of the chief god of Caesarea Philippi. Some of you who remember Greek mythology, you remember Pan, who was half human, half goat. This is the remains. You can go there. You could jump a plane right now, fly to Tel Aviv, take a cheroot for about $30 and get there. And you could stand in front of Caesarea Philippi, the ruins. These are the ruins of the temple of Pan. This was the chief god that was worshipped. They believed, the locals believed, the ancients believed, there was a cave here. There's this cave at the base of the temple. They would take goats, sacrifice goats, throw them in the water in the cave, and if the goats did not float, if the goats went into the cave and did not come back, Pan had received their sacrifice. And so they would toss animals in there in this cultic practice. They believed that that was a god that brought fertility to their crops and also their bodies. And so in the springtime, they believed that in the winter, Pan and all the gods would go into the cave and they would hide, or they would sleep for the winter. And in the springtime, they would come out. And the way to get the god out of the cave and bring fertility to your body and fertility to your land was to offer sacrifice. It was also, and I know there are those in the room, so I'll be careful here, it was also to engage in cultic prostitution in that temple, to go and sleep with the temple prostitutes, male and female. And they took it a step further. If you really wanted to get your god, Pan's favor upon your family, then they would engage in this city in bestiality with goats. I shall say no more.
Thanks.
And so the ancients literally believed that this cave, they called it the gates of Hades. It was the gates to the underworld there in Caesarea Philippi. And Jesus brings his young, impressionable Jewish disciples here. They go from a little conservative Jewish village, nothing going to happen here. Why would he take them 25 miles north to the Vegas Strip?
That's a good example.
Why would he take them north to Vegas? Why would he take them to the red light district of Amsterdam? Apparently, I wish we could debate that question, but apparently it's in the text, it's simply to ask them a question, right? He takes them to Caesarea Philippi to ask them one question, and the whole gospel turns on this question, and I would argue your entire life turns on this question. And the question, if we go back to our text, is what? What is, somebody read it, Lauren read it, but what is the question he wants answered here? Who do people say I am? He takes them to Caesarea Philippi. Who do people say I am? That's the question. Who is this Jesus? And various answers are given, right? Well, some say John the Baptist, because Mark 6 says that Herod the Great, Herod, his son who executed John the Baptist, there was a rumor going around that he'd actually been raised from the dead. And so some people are like, well, Jesus must be John the Baptist, like reincarnated and back from the dead. And others say Elijah the prophet, because Elijah never what? Elijah never dies, so maybe he's Elijah. And then some are like, he's just one of the prophets. Are they wrong? No. But it's like they see him, but they kind of see him a little bit blurry. Oh. You mean like a tree, kind of like walking around? Like Mark is lifting the veil. He's been lifting the veil more and more and more, and there's this progressive thing going on. Who is this Jesus? Who is this Jesus? Who is this Jesus? You're the Messiah. I can see clearly. I mean, maybe that's why Mark puts these stories up against each other. Maybe there's something going on here. This healing of this blind man progressively, who now sees Jesus clearly, but he saw him a little bit blurry. And people are even like, I don't know, is he John the Baptist? Is he Elijah? Is he a prophet? He's obviously a holy man, but I kind of see him a little bit blurry. And then Jesus then says, but what about you? And then his question, if we go ahead here, let me jump ahead, is this, but what about you? Who do you say I am? And that is the pivotal question, right? I mean, that's where this whole thing has been building. Who do you, Jesus says, say that I am? In his classic book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis writes that it's that question alone that is the question every human must answer. Who is this Jesus? And he writes much more eloquently than I could. He says this: a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. That's what Lewis gave us 60 or so years ago. What to do with this Jesus? Who is this Jesus? And like I said, each of us must come to the point when this story and their story becomes our story, right? Every human being must come to that point where it's like, and this is where Mark has been building. That's why it's the pivotal question, the hinge question, and the trajectory of this story and the trajectory of human history and the trajectory of your life and my life hinges on how we answer that question. Who was this Jesus? Every one of us. I wish we had time to tell the stories, but for those of you who are following Jesus, I bet you have a moment in your life when you can say, I saw Jesus clearly. You remember that, when the veil was lifted and you're like, it was like at that moment I began to see more clearly. It's like something new began to grow. It was like this began to burst forth in my life. And I saw clearly, and now I get that great English poet and Anglican clergyman, John Newton, who wrote, I once was blind, but now I see. And that's where Mark has been taking us. And so Peter says, you are the Messiah. And their eyes, blind eyes, are fully open and they see clearly. Now I love what Matthew does here. I just got to take one little side step to Matthew. I know we're in Mark. Matthew records the same exact account, the only other gospel writer who does. When Peter says, "You're the Messiah," Jesus' response is this: "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it."
Nice.
You tell me geography doesn't matter where he says this. Where is he standing when he says this?
That's awesome.
In front of the gates of hell. He's standing in Caesarea Philippi. He's standing on the Strip in Vegas. You're right, Peter. And I'm not going to avoid evil. I'm going to attack its very gates. That's what I'm about to do, Peter. It's going to be a very different road, because everything is now going to change. And he says this there. And he's letting the seen and the unseen world know a battle is about to ensue. Get ready for the next 8 chapters. There is going to be a journey to Jerusalem from the very north in Caesarea Philippi, where as far north as you can go, Jesus begins now to journey to Jerusalem. And this battle is going to be had. But I got to take my boys to the very gates of hell. And I got to show them I'm not afraid of this. I'm going to overcome this. Follow me, boys. Watch what happens. It's going to be a tough road, I know, but that's where it's going. He's not going to hide from evil. He's going to storm its very gates. Isn't that amazing when you start to read some of the history behind this and you get into like where he's saying these things? It matters. He's standing in front of the temple of Pan at the gates of hell. And he says those words. All right, we got to finish this up. Next reader, 31 to 33. Who would read these 3 verses for us quickly? I hear them strumming up music in there. I'm supposed to get us all the way to verse 38. Who's reading? Come on, Atlanta, go. 31 to 38. He then
began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be respected by the elders, rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns."
Thank you, Anna. Did you feel the tenor and the tone suddenly shift? It's been power, it's been authority, it's been healing, it's been calming seas, it's been demonstrations of authority, and Jesus is the Messiah. And it's like, yes, Peter, you're right, and now I'm going to suffer. It says he then began to teach them that he was going to suffer. He says, if you go back to the beginning, the Son of Man must suffer, be rejected, be killed, and on the 3rd day rise again. And if you think those Jewish boys had any idea what he's talking about, we're missing the point. They have no clue what he's talking about. What do you mean? What do you mean suffer? What do you mean reject? What do you mean die? Rise again? Come on. What are you talking about? That's why Peter pulls him aside and rebukes him. Because when Peter gives his answer, you're the Messiah, you're the Savior, Peter has a very different Messiah in mind. What is Peter thinking?
Someone to overthrow the government.
Oh, you're going to take that. You're taking down the empire, aren't you? That's why when they try to arrest him, Peter pulls a sword. It's go time. We're taking down the empire, and we're starting with that guy's ear. Trust me, he wasn't aiming for his ear. Fisherman, bad swordsman. Is it possible to get the right answer but have the absolute wrong trajectory in mind? I've got the right answer. Yes, you're right. And I'm going to suffer, be rejected, and killed. And Peter's like, no, we're not going there. We're going to win. And Jesus says, yeah, we're going to win, and it's going to look like losing for a long time. It's going to look like we've lost, Peter. It's going to look like it's all fallen apart, Peter. And it's going to be a tough road, this whole winning thing. And that's why Jesus sternly rebukes Peter and says, do not dissuade me from where I am going here. And I know that evokes a lot of questions as well. And the rest, this is Jesus saying, Peter, this is how we are going to storm the gates of Hades. This is how we're going to overcome the evil that has taken a root in the human heart. This is the road this is what I'm about to do, Peter. I'm going to let it do its absolute worst to me. I'm going to take it on. I'm going to let the empire take my life. And then 3 days, I'm going to defeat even that. And then then there'll be nothing that has authority over me.
Preach.
Not even death. I will conquer that too. Who wants to sign up for that? And before you raise your hand too quickly, everyone's like, yeah, let's go do it. Jesus continues, and he says, and you know what this is going to look like? I promise you this is the final passage, because you know that, because it's at the end of your paper there. He says, he calls the crowd to him, and he says, if you want to be my follower, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. That will not build a megachurch. That right there, you want to empty a church and all the followers. You start preaching that. You want to follow me, Jesus says. Deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me. He says. He continues. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel, we'll save it. We'll stop there. If we are tempted to believe or to think that following Jesus and his kingdom in this world only means a few minor adjustments to our normal, ordinary lives, Jesus blows that out of the water here. And he says, you're sorely mistaken. And what Jesus offers his disciples is a different kind of road, and he calls them to a different way of living. It's worth noting, that, and this will be the last thing, because I know we're done. This is the first Sunday of Lent, right? This is the first Sunday where we're turning our attention toward the cross. And we're beginning to make our march towards Jerusalem. You'd almost think we set up this series for this to happen on this Sunday. It was almost that planned. That the rest of this series and the rest of our journey to Easter will have to journey with Jesus to the cross. Because the next 8 chapters of Mark, the rest take place in 1 week of his. The first 7.5 chapters, 3 years. The last 8 chapters, 1 week. He zeroes in on this 1 week, the last week of the life of Christ. And he begins it by saying, so if you want to follow, deny yourself. And I guarantee you this means a whole lot more than don't eat chocolate for the next 56 days or stay off social media. Okay, that's all well and good. That's not what Jesus intended here. He's basically saying here, this is going to mean radically reorienting all of our priorities, all of our plans, and all of our agendas. It's this denial of self. And then, of course, this call. Can you imagine these young Jewish boys and all the other crowd who were there, men and women listening to him that day, who, when he says, take up your cross, for them it only meant one thing. The absolute worst form of humiliation and torture the empire had ever developed. This did not mean go get a really cool tattoo on your bicep. This did not mean, take up your cross. And no. This was like, and you are going to follow this, and it may take us right through death. But if you follow me, Jesus is promising, I will take you right through death and out the other side.
Wow.
And not even that will conquer. Is that good news that the world needs to hear today? Think about the world that we're living in today, the fear that is sweeping our globe right now. I mean, think of that, and then think of the good news the church has to offer as we walk this road with Jesus. I think I should close this way. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was part of the Confessing Church in Germany, spoke out against Hitler and the Nazi regime in the 40s. They eventually hung him 21 days before Hitler committed suicide. He was hung 3 weeks before. He writes in his book, The Cost of Discipleship, he has this marvelous quote about this idea of picking up one's cross, and I think we should end with this. He says this, the cross is not the terrible end to an otherwise God-fearing and happy life, but it meets us at the beginning of our communion with Christ. When Christ calls a man or woman, he bids them come and die. And on the first Sunday of Lent, I know that can seem ominous, but in light of taking communion today and some of the reflections that you've had there is no other call. Bonhoeffer and others who spoke out vehemently in their day, they knew, and that was the fate that they did face. And they knew that the cross is not just the end. It's not just this end of an otherwise happy life. This is the beginning. We start our communion with Christ at the cross, where Jesus says, follow me. It may mean you come and die to some things. For Bonhoeffer, it meant literally laying down his life. But is that not the essence of what this is all about? I know our children's workers are just dying for us to come and see them in that tiny little room. I have more I could say, but I'm going to leave it there with Bonhoeffer. Let's pray together, and next week we'll be back, hopefully, in a circle, and we will continue, and we will begin this journey next week from Caesarea Philippi down the hill, and it will end in Jerusalem on another hill on a cross. Jesus, thank you for your word. It is so life-giving, even as it challenges so much. It rubs us the wrong way. It pulls some stuff up in me, even this morning, that I want to say no to. I want to say, nah, it can't be that. It can't be that. But Lord, I thank you. I thank you for your word, and I thank you for what it does in us, and to us, and through us. And I pray that we would live lives worthy of this calling. And I pray that we, like those who have gone before, would be willing to come and die and lay down our lives and deny ourselves and pick up your agenda and your way. Help us to do that. This is so very hard. This is difficult work. But we want to be about the work of your kingdom. And so as we journey from this Sunday all the way to Resurrection Sunday, we want to stay with you. Even when it's tough, even when it means walking through death and out the other side, we will be there. Find us faithful, we pray in Jesus' name.
Amen.
I do not know how we are closing today. I think the chairs are just staying here. We'll probably eventually stack them, but we can't take anything to the other room because they are voting. That will all happen sometime later this week. As always, if you need prayer, we'll hang around. But thank you for your attention and your participation today. I hope this was kind of fun. A little bit different, but I kind of like this. A little bit fun. What is ordinary anyway, right? So who knows what the next few weeks will bring. Grace and peace to you.